Cab Volk started off as this like art project, like performance art, almost a musical at points, right?
They started out in a van with a PA inside it, and then they would just roll up,
going around,
open the doors, make some fucking unholy noise, close the doors, and drive away again.
Hey folks, welcome to this on podcast. My name is Mark. I am joined by Chris Bruce.
Yeah, Jesus, man, that's good. I mean, I almost regret going with it in the first place now.
Chris Bruce.
And we, talking of multiple names, we are joined once more by P6, aka Phil Eaglesham. Phil, do you know that every time I see that bus in Glasgow, I think of you in a little... There's a bus to Eaglesham that cuts about in Glasgow regularly, and it always makes me smile and think of Phil.
Such would be my fucking wealth that I could live on Eaglesham Road, Eaglesham. But let's face it, I've been there and I'll never be able to afford to live there.
It's a nice bus ride if you ever get the chance, though. You can go by it.
Do you know that?
Your nose pressed in the window.
You know the bus to Erskine when we were wee Stretchheads? The number 23.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, there we go.
So, if you're back, it's because you are up for the task of following us through the history, discography of the band Cabaret Voltaire. In part one, we talked a wee bit about the context around Cabaret Voltaire. Obviously, we introduced Phil in the process. Phil was a big fan of the band. He's very steeped in the history of, I would say, the British industrial and noise scene, especially, even though a lot of your own music was probably closer to noise rock, the stuff that you're known for. But you've got your own electronic projects as well. Cabaret Voltaire have left a mark on Phil, as so many other bands, not just in the UK, around the world. So Phil's going to take us through this by the hand, because it's a protracted and sometimes bumpy ride, but it's also very, very interesting. I am consistently amazed at how many bands I can hear in the sounds of and I say sounds plural because the sound does evolve. Before we get down that road, Mark, we should say thanks to the Variety Bar in Glasgow.
Of course, yeah, that's where we hang out every single time we do one of these podcasts. We also have this studio which we're in.
No Mean Radio.
No Mean Radio.
Thanks to Sean and Gail.
Part of the network that we're on.
Yep.
Yeah. So.
Phil, what are your first impressions of this studio?
It's an absolute portal. As we said, it doesn't have that stink of when Stretchheads used to play in Sunset Studios in Paisley.
Oh, goodness.
Smelled of earwax.
Oh,
You go home at night and you just smell of earwax.
It's powerfully stinking smell.
Pretty cushy, actually.
It's nice, eh? Did you
nice.
enjoy the Narnia experience of like, has that door always been there?
Yeah. I actually came down earlier on. I came to the venue early and I started kind of feeling the walls, just wondering whether there was,
see which ones are hollow.
A special code.
Yeah, totally. Right.
But I know my way around the dark room, as you know.
You do indeed, Phil. You do indeed. Okay. Will we get turning about this?
Let's talk about Cabaret Voltaire's discography.
Brace yourselves.
Cabaret Voltaire alone, just that project released almost an album a year for the first decade and a half, sometimes more than one, as we've said. So we do need to skim, but it gives us a nice sense of this, what I would say is predominantly a slow evolution, but at points significant creative leaps. We're not going to be strictly chronological in release date, but because I'd like to touch on the early stuff. So we'll start with Cabaret Voltaire 74 to 76, which was actually released, I think, was it 84 that came out, that collection? There's a few iterations
some of
it.
It came out on a cassette in Industrial, actually, prior to that. So it's kind of re-released later on.
Yeah, that was in 80, the Industrial one, and then I think it came out again in 84. But anyway, highly experimental. You know, we've talked about what was the state of experimental electronics at this point. You know, where did they sit in the scene? I think just to pick something out of it, the third track, A Sunday Night in Biot, quite punishing and grounded, I would suggest, in art more so than music, inverted commas. I think tracks, you know, like the Dada Man, I read, I think it was it Chris talking about this, saying that they named it before the project even took on Cabaret Voltaire, so the Dadaist thing is in there from the start. There's a real purity and freedom in this collection that we'll come back to touch on, just that issue of purity at the end of the show. But you basically are hearing young musicians who have no real sense of what they ought to sound like, or what sound will be most advantageous, what is optimal for success. It is literally the brain spill of just young people, and I think it's truly fascinating. It's an honesty level that you don't get very often from a lot of people, you know, it's who want to curate their kind of early history to sort of...
They're clearly quite isolated, you know. I mean, you can joke about bedroom albums, and it's really interesting that we've kind of come back to that now with everyone having access to it.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
I remember Matt Johnson talking about Thomas Lear, who's an amazing electronic pioneer who lives in Greenock. And when he recorded his single, he recorded it with the vocals quite low because he was literally sharing a bedroom with his girlfriend and didn't want to wake her up. But when like Matt Johnson heard that, he was just like, I really love the breathy vocals, man. and you know, but then it blew his mind that he could record that in his own bedroom and inspired him to form the. So when I hear that early material, it feels like there's fun happening as well. I mean, Do the Snake is hilarious, it has to be said. And I think we lose sight of the kind of a little bit of humour that's going on there as well. That they're having a laugh with it. And they're also, I mean, as someone who had a reel-to-reel when I grew up, you know, I used to record off the radio and the reel-to-reel and then do like wee cut-ups and things, and it's fun, you know, it's just fun to fuck things up and just make stupid sounds, and with no ego, with no sense of whether you're going to do anything with it.
That's the word.
Beautiful industrial, and we can call it industrial now, but it's just egoless experimentation.
I think that's it. There's no sense of self-brand. There's just a like, oh, this noise is cool. This noise is fun. Let's create something with this. Let's try this. Let's try that. And there is no self-censorship. At least it doesn't appear like there's much in this. And I really engaged with that purity. I will be honest, it's not a massive, re-listenable record for me because of when I came up in music, but it is incredible to hear just that openness, and it made me quite reflective. And as I say, we'll touch on that. It was actually followed in, I think it was 80. The next one came out. Oh no, in fact, no, it was Extended Play EP.
Extended Play EP comes out on Rough Trade, so it's one of the first Rough Trade.
First official release as well by the band, and that featured the Do the Mussolini head kick. It's notably not Dance the Mussolini by DAF.
Deutsche Amerikanische Freundschaft
from 1981,
but possibly inspired that actually.
Although it does share some aspects of the German underground in that, as well as lots of the spring reverb techniques that we talked about at Lee Perry and that dub production that they were fans of. I think they actually used the Watkins copycat for the delays in this. It's much more unorthodox and glitchy as a track compared to the likes of the DAF tracks. Mal does observe at this period that the band were debating the degree of the structure in their songs. He said, these are fun for us to listen to, but maybe we should try to distill this feeling into tracks that are slightly more coherent so we can send them out to other people.
I know, we're having fun.
Yeah.
We're not sure everyone else is going to have fun with us. I mean, that EP is interesting because it's got a Velvet Underground cover on it as well.
That's right, it does.
You know, and I think the Velvets, when you start to hear, especially even when we start to get into Slugging for Jesus period, you start to hear the violin's still getting used, viola's still getting used. You know, there's elements of the Velvets and Roxy that are still around. So they didn't completely abandon conventional instruments. They just used them as part of that kind of mix.
I think as well, just to reflect on the humour and the willingness to engage with kind of like, you know, slightly taboo subjects, albeit in a satirical fashion. Mal continues, in our own mad world, we created a dance called Do the Mussolini, brackets head kick, which was obviously anti-fascist. We were making a statement, but it was also intended to take the piss. That was what was one of the lines? Black shirts and perverts.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. In 78, they also just shortly after brought out Nag Nag Nag, the single, which I think it's quite different. Post-punk, really quite raggedy, lots of structure in it compared to the other stuff. It suggests to me a potential branching off point for the band that they didn't actually take. It kind of falls into the same territory, I would say, as bands like Suicide and maybe even Tuxedo Moon, those kind of things. And apparently it came from them doing the cover of No Escape, the track by the Seeds. And Mal was talking about how rather than always sharing the royalties, they decided to just write their own equivalent of that track. To the Quietus, he'd said, Jarvis Cocker always says this is the best track ever. I think what gets me about how popular this track is we're sort of known as these groundbreaking pioneers of electronic music, and it's the least electronic track we ever did. And I do kind of listen to this track and think of it as a bit of a sliding doors moment.
If you were anywhere near a students' union or an alternative night that we had on like a Tuesday night, we used to go to Bennett's. Like, because the gay disco in Glasgow was like one of the few places the goths could go and not get beaten up by the psychobillies. You would hear Nag Nag Nag. and you heard Nag 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 probably straight at the opening or the closing of most alternative nights in Glasgow for at least a decade. It's an absolute banger. It's a total monster, and when obviously they're touring again now, and everyone's like, if they don't do Nag Nag Nag, like no Nag Nag Nag, no party, and it's a really celebratory, kind of aggressive, but quite weirdly funky track.
Well, I mean, they must have noticed that by falling in line somewhat with the structure of the song, it did make it so useful in those situations. I mean, you were talking about, something you said earlier on made me think of this rather. Cab Volk started off as this like art project, like performance art, almost a musical at points, right?
They started out in a van with a PA inside it, and then they would just roll up,
going around,
open the doors, make some fucking unholy noise, close the doors, and drive away again.
And then on the flip side of that, on the other side of that, really, you've got bands like Wire, who started off as this brilliantly written, succinct little punk band, but yet the two acts converged to often quite similar points in their kind of early to mid-career of experimentation, where the structure is still quite fluid, and they're starting to get in with the electronic noises, Manscape and all that kind of stuff happens for a while.
There's that laterally, but I think Mike Thorne is really important in Wire's career as well. And I know, Ferruccio's talked about this in your previous episodes, that, his production as well kind of freed them up. And they're on Harvest, they're not a prog rock record label. But like 154 is still like, it's still quite experimental.
I think it's great how those two bands as an example, come from such different starting points, and I don't think they sound like each other, but they clearly embrace the same sense of like, let's go to some new places.
Aye.
They really go to some new places on Three Mantras from 1980. It's actually
the Three Mantras that has two tracks on it.
Yeah,
which again is such a piss take.
The cover of the record had a sticker apologising for not having 3 tracks on it, and they then said, "Oh, we've priced it as a single as an apology because it's like 40 minutes long."
It's an album. Essentially, I guess it's an album, but it's kind of, the thing is, there's a bit of dissection here where people are like, "Is it an album as in a collection of songs? Is it an EP as in like a couple of tracks in a remix, or is it like an EP as in a concept?" And they fucked around with formats all the way through their career.
Yeah.
It's a really odd record. It's properly out there in many ways. I think Western Mantra is an easier listen.
Definitely.
Eastern Mantra has the words, "The Human League looped backwards throughout 20 minutes.
It's a proper whitey.
Is it good? It's certainly bold. All right, I've skipped past a wee bit, sorry, chronologically. Mix Up, 1979.
Yeah. It's like you were saying, the Seeds cover is on Mix Up.
Yeah, so this is the debut album. Sorry, excuse me jumping ahead. I was a bit too excited to talk about Three Mantras there, but the debut album, it's a really big one, clearly. Picking out a couple of bits of it that really struck me. Photophobia works best for me, given that it's got that slow simmering groove of the percussion in the background.
Yeah.
I also think the 7th one, On Every Other Street, has a playfulness with elements that remind me of Fugazi's instrument release.
Interesting.
I mean, Fugazi, as much as we know them as a hardcore band and or a kind of experimental hardcore band or whatever, they were very clued up on a lot of what was going on in the UK. Ian McKay's spoken about Gang of Four and stuff, and Cabaret Voltaire were not out of their purview. And you can definitely hear an instrument when they start warping tapes and experimenting. And
bear in mind, there's no drummer on every other street.
No, absolutely.
But it sounds amazing.
But
and
the dubbiness as well. I mean, that's something about Fugazi. It was always very dubby, and I think Cabaret Voltaire are one of the first points where you start to hear that dragged into kind of conventionally sort of British kind of music circles that might cross the decks.
Probably them
of
in the pop group.
Yeah. So there's no question they were familiar with them. I love the dubbiness of that of this record, especially the fact that it actually starts to emerge more prominently towards the back end of the record. Phil, I mean, what are your thoughts on Mix Up? It's such a
I think there's a very kind of Cosmish, kind of German influence on this. I can hear kind of Faust Can kind of dubby loops going on. Definitely. it's got, like most of their early records, it's got a tension between, do we kind of go back to that experimentation and kind of gnarly industrial kind of making people feel frightened, or do we actually draw in through these loops something quite hypnotic and also potentially danceable? On Every Other Street's my favourite track on it because it just clearly highlights guerrilla warfare and it's paranoid as fuck. It's absolute William Burroughs territory, and it's, you know, it's them taking, a bit like TG were at the time when they're doing Heathen Earth, you know, it's drawing in, you know, the world is a war film, as they called it. It's drawing in some of that fear and kind of the media of fear and drawing it in and kind of distilling it down. So, I mean, that's always a standout for me. I think Accept Nothing is also, it's pure Kraftwerk slowed down. So that, again, they're kind of, for me, they're still drawing together and pulling together the psychedelic edge of the track Capsules, for instance, quite Velvet Underground-y, and then they're drawing in the German kind of influence and the motoric kind of motoric sense of kind of percussion, and then they're also still paying attention to the past and doing that Seeds cover and saying, well, actually, there's a whole garage rock thing there that we're making some really interesting sounds. So it almost feels like they're curating their own album.
Yeah. I mean, for me, Expect Nothing was probably my favourite song on the record.
It's very hypnotic.
That dubbiness of it. It actually reminded me of the bass line of Guns of Brixton, which came out a year later. So clearly they were all thinking about that kind of that dubby influence, you know, which the Clash were ended up playing with a little bit as well. And I like the Seeds cover as well. I think the Seeds cover is like, it's got an energy to it, which is definitely 77 punk for me. You know,
there's actually a video of them doing that on a moor somewhere up in Yorkshire. You know, and they're like, you know, they're out, you know, with their little kind of electronic instruments and, you know, their guitars and, you know, standing in the fucking blistering cold of like the Yorkshire moors. But I think they actually filmed it slightly later, because if you look at it, you know, they don't look like how they looked. Mal hasn't got the wedge. So I think we'll talk about it, but I think that's where they start to really get back and they revisit their back catalogue and kind of do video representations of some of their earlier material, because they're poised to actually become a video act.
Yeah.
So I've already shot my bolt with Three Mantras, but Voice of America was also in 1980. And I think, you know, it might have a comparatively normie 10 tracks compared to like Three Mantras, but it's still way out there. Avant-garde, applicable cliche, scant moments of straight musicality for, you know, less deviant listeners by their standards at least. I think the slacker spankiness of the seventh one, Stay Out of It, is quite interesting. Mal's bass on Obsession is a real standout. Yeah, he's a really good bass player. Like, and I think for such a noise-based band, he is very, very tight as a performer.
He's incredible, and I often say this as well. You should look at what Cozy does on a guitar. I mean, people are like, "Oh, best guitarist ever." I'm just like, Cozy turned the guitar inside out. She's a fucking great player, you know. And Mal's an amazing bass player. And this genre isn't necessarily. People would be very shy about any sense of kind of, you know, eloquence. You know, it's all very on the level. It's all, you know, it doesn't like any kind of elitism. But I just marvel at but Obsession particularly stands out for me. It's just the bass line. It
kind of holds
funky.
a lot of these releases together. The quality of it. I think the distorted tub thumping of News from Nowhere as well, the 9th track's a real standout thing. But overall, Voice of America is a pretty esoteric listen.
It's quite pitched. So they open the live set now still with the same opening. So the opening is actually a public announcement from the last ever Beatles tour.
Oh yeah, that's right.
It's by Police in Tennessee in 1966, and they still open their show with that. You know, there'll be no running. You know, I've got some. If your ears are bleeding, we've got some cotton kind of thing. Looking after the police, not looking after the audience. And there's a sense of mounting kind of anxiety and paranoia that comes through with the album. I think This Is Entertainment is still their kind of like their calling card. It's such a fuck you to the audience. It's like, this is entertainment, this is fun, and it's quite an abrasive,
but that's confrontational in its delivery as well.
I think that, and that's based on their experience of live performance. I think as well. It's interesting, and it gets kind of partly compared, I think, as well. If you listen to what Eno's doing on My Life in the Bush of Ghosts with David Byrne, you know, he's also starting to now bring in
That's going to get a shout.
Samples.
Yep.
He's bringing in radio stuff. But it has to be said, Eno was doing that way. Eno was doing that way before he did that record in 1981. And Holger Zucke from Cannes used to have a radio on stage, and he would tune in stuff, and he would find like Arabic radio stations and just put it through the PA. So it wasn't a new technique. But I think they're also, again, they're still lifting from that kind of German tradition.
Yeah. Johnny Yes No, the soundtrack to a short film, it was 1980 as well. Is it Peter Kay?
So Peter Kay's a really interesting director. I mean, he did quite a few videos laterally. He
did Springsteen.
Did he?
Yeah.
Wow.
Tina Turner.
Simply the best.
No, not unfortunately for all the Rangers fans out there. Unfortunately, no. It was kind of 87. I can't remember the name of the track.
He did Orbison. He did REM.
REM videos, definitely.
Depeche Mode.
Loads of Depeche Mode. He did Stripped for Depeche Mode before they kind of hooked up with Anton Corbijn. Care was the guy. So very, very interesting director. But he made a film called Johnny Yes No, which they did the soundtrack for. The taxi music, which is one of the main kind of sequences, very hypnotic, very kind of Fela Kuti informed, it has to be said. I think they're clearly listening to a lot of African music at this point.
They talk about Moroccan music at this point.
Yeah. So they're taking stuff from the African continent and they're kind of turning it into electronic beats. So it's an interesting. It's not the greatest. I wouldn't say it's a great watch unless you're feeling a bit stoned. But I mean, that's what it was made for. But also, what's important is they do Johnny Yes No, but also this is also where they're starting to form Double Vision.
Yeah.
And Double Vision as a video company and as a video production company is taking Peter Kay in, but it then becomes, if you look at the roster, it's bringing out, while people are buying Cabaret Voltaire records, they can get Throbbing Gristle Archive video material, they can get Residence material, they can get Yellow, they can get all of these other people that are doing weird stuff. Survival research laboratories that's going on in San Francisco, which is like this huge fucking industrial kind of full-scale performance art project where they're just smashing stuff up. Eventually that becomes Robot Wars, so they're curating at the same time. And this is where Paul Smith's really interesting. I think that he came into their lives kind of around that time that they're starting to formulate that. But I think Johnny Yes No comes in slightly after, the kind of Rough Trade period, because it's in that nexus of where they're starting to shift over and they've run the course.
Third release of that year, and it just is as a measure of how prolific they were. And it's followed by Red Mecca in 81, which is the record that before I was really able to pinpoint the timeline and the landscape of Cabaret Voltaire for this show, it's the album that the people cooler than I, of which there are many, said this is the classic Red Mecca. That got picked out a lot. And as a result, I was a wee bit surprised at kind of how dank and obstinate it is as an album. It might not be a 20-minute long reverse loop, but it's certainly not Uptown Girl either. It's like the sixth track in it, Split Second Feeling, it stands out as an example of electropunk, which is really I'm going to drop the Moby and Animal Rights here, by the way. This is a progenitor of Moby's Animal Rights. It's electropunk. It is clearly straight into the desk, that kind of stuff. I think the band have clearly decided to commit to this uber cool, sinister, drawled, sprechgesang vocal approach as well that becomes quite identifiable as them for a good number of years.
Yeah,
I think. Sorry, Mark.
I was just going to say that clearly this is a record which has got a lot of resonance for them, because they keep returning to the visual language of this record throughout their career, especially in later records as well. Richard Kirk obviously uses similar visual motifs for all the stuff he does when the band comes, but when it comes back just as him. But even some of their even some of the 90s stuff has got a similar visual language to this record. I think it's probably one they also seem to think quite highly of as well. And I think it's definitely the top. I think it's the top rated one on Rate Your Music as well amongst fans.
It's very beloved, and there's a couple of things that you're right. The visual aspect, the cover it's taken from video feedback, and you can see. I mean, Richard particularly starts experimenting with that, with the visual side, which is is interesting. Chris is very into the sonics. Mal is bringing the beats and a lot of the black influence into the music, and Kirk is starting to kind of wander between. He still holds on to some of his, he still plays the saxophone from time to time, and and he's still got his chops, but he's really interested in that kind of video edge. What's beautiful about this record is that it opens and closes with a track called "A Touch of Evil," and in reference to Orson Welles.
Wow.
So it's in reference to that film noir. And if you
It's a
look
good
at,
film,
I've
by the way.
got
It's a good
beautiful
film.
film, and I've got the Industrial Handbook,
Yep, you do.
which is a bit of the Bible. We'll skip over the Boyd Rice chapter, but there's Cabaret Voltaire included in that.
We'll no doubt be back to it in the future.
And they actually, well, we might need to mention it with the Coil episode, but they mentioned they basically have a list of
Yeah.
like videos.
Oh yeah.
And this is the thing it's actually quite similar in a way to Coil and very similar to TG, that these bands become like an encyclopedia for you. So they're referencing and they're recommending lots of stuff, and Orson Welles is in there, along with Buñuel and Warhol, and they're clearly these are like working class guys that kind of came up, but they've got a voracious art appetite, and they're really interested in the media.
Yeah, I have to say there's a parallel with my own experience, obviously a generation after, but coming up with Nirvana. One of the things that was so interesting to be about Nirvana was not so much of the things that are usually touted about them are not what drew me in. Cobain was a voracious consumer of interesting outsider art.
Absolutely.
And he switched me on to so many different things that were nothing at all to do with grunge music. They were completely separate.
He was
from that.
championing the raincoats, and to an extent. I mean, I heard Courtney doing the rounds at the moment, saying, "Oh, I played Kirk, The Killing Moon," and he was like, "Oh God, it's kind of so romantic," and she was just like, she was slagging off and saying, "Come on, I know you look back at all the stuff that you say is really cool and that you're really into, but at the end of the day, the fucking lyrics to Pretty in Pink backwards. We all fucking do. Like, don't be afraid of pop music." But at the same time, I also saw an interview with Pete Burns.
I saw that as well.
She used to hang about outside fucking Probe Records and call him a
abusing
faggot.
and
yeah,
he was like, "I wish you would die."
Oh yeah. Well, God rest his soul. But I think that's part of it. The standout really, and where they're at, they have these kind of shorter tracks. Messages Received, I think, is incredible. I used to put that on my fucking answer phone. Messages Received. Doo doo. It's always got that kind of like syndrome kind of thing, but they do it in such a filtered way that it works. But 1,000 Ways is like so hypnotic, and the live version on their Live at the Lyceum, which came out, it was the second, the first ever cassette that Rough Trade brought out was the C81 cassette,
Yeah,
copy one,
which we've spoken about on the show,
which is absolutely seminal, incredible, and you bought the NME and then you had to cut up the pages to create your own little booklet and stuff. Copy 2 is Cabaret Voltaire Live at the Lyceum, and the version of 1,000 Ways, like Joe, my comrade Joe Ahmed, he always cites that as possibly the greatest Cabaret Voltaire moment of all time, because it's so punishing and so hypnotic, but also so seductive. So the album, I mean, again, they're kind of curating something, and they're pulling stuff together that seems not to work together. But as a whole, Red Mecca often stands up really as a kind of calling card for where they'd got to and what they'd achieved by that point. They started to become masters of the craft.
It's interesting for me, though, because it's not an album that particularly resonated with me, just being honest. What did resonate with me was in 1982. Is it pronounced High?
High.
So this live album, which is recorded in Japan, I think it really deserves a mention, because it is insightful into the band out with a studio. What were you seeing there? And there is a marked change, I think, as stronger structures start to appear within their music. The tracks are quite long, but they really carry you as a listener in a way that's not nearly as difficult as Red Mecca or the stuff before. For example, there's little calling cards like bags of chorus in the bass that invites comparisons with Joy Division and The Cure. But the post-punk nature of the songs, I think, feels much closer to Wire or even at points Gang of Four, due to that stronger reliance on the beats and Mal's bass ability. And actually, it was the first time that in their listening, I really, two screening it and you're like, oh, wait a minute. And you kind of look across and you're like, what is this? And it really grabbed me.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a kind of
It's a magnificent performance. And also they're touring their arse off. This is the other thing that must have been so kind of frustrating, that, all these fingers are crossed down at the Rough Trade office in Talbot Road that Scritti Politti are going to have like a worldwide hit. Of course, Scritti Politti are like, yeah, thanks for that, and they fuck off and signed to Virgin, right? But, the Cabs, as you say, are churning out all this material, but also they're a really great live prospect, and they're out They're out on tour.
This proves it.
High's a fantastic bootleg.
And they absolutely nail that to the wall with the fact that the same year they bring out 2x45 or 2x45 or 2x45. Basically, the studio version of where High showed the band was at. This one really works for me. And yes, I realise that might be partly due to the fact that it's the first one where they bring in live drums.
Yeah, they bring Alan Fish in.
Yeah. There was
great drummer.
According to the band, there was a conscious
Mick Fish.
Mick Fish, yeah.
Aye.
A conscious decision to turn towards a sort of greater commercial appeal.
Yeah.
The New Order had introduced him to John Robbie, celebrated producer of the time, and within this, I can hear a lot of certainly like the new rave movement, the DNA for that. Bands like the Rapture. There's a rickety, floppy post-punk kind of looseness that crosses into electronics. It's also got Yashar in it. The second track,
banger.
This album,
it's a class song.
It hosts that watershed moment for the band. It really broke them into a lot of other dance clubs. By the way, Hebrew word for upright.
Yes, it is.
I think
upstanding.
Yeah, we noticed that that's also why it's now being used for some odious Israeli political party. But having never spent much time with this record prior, I'd suggest that this album in particular is aged particularly well. As clearly there's dozens of contemporary bands still trying to imitate this sound. I said to you, Phil, before we pressed record, that in Glasgow I can hear this album at play. These bands that I'm like, it sounds like they're doing someone, but I can't work out who they're doing. And for a number of them, this is who they're doing. And fair play, it's a good thing to do. But it is interesting this band nailed this quite so well.
But it was done in 1982.
Yeah.
And also, as I said, format-wise, they're bringing it out on 2 12-inch singles deliberately. Because as you said, they're in New York.
And they knew the dance floor.
They're getting to New York. So they're meeting John Robbie, who's basically Soul Sonic Force, and Arthur Baker's fucking right-hand man. And they do talk about Bambaataa in interviews and stuff. So they're kind of in touch with really early hip-hop. So they're like, well, why don't we bring it out onto 12-inch singles instead? And they bring it out in this Neville Brody kind of artwork. And Neville Brody is the artist that they've kind of worked with all the way through their career. Incredible artist. Goes on to be a huge graphic designer in the 80s. But they're making this kind of art project, kind of, it folds out as it's a black envelope that folds out, and then inside there's a sumptuous silver artwork, and there's these 2 12-inch singles. I mean, for me, it's up there with Metal Box. It's so important as a record. And then it's just been reissued by Rough Trade as 3x45.
Oh, really?
So they've reissued it basically with some extra mixes on it, with the Yashar mixes on it, and they've spread it out. I think this is it's strongly related to the compilation that we're going to talk about at hand, but it really, because it brings in Alan Fish, who was in a band Hula, a fantastic Sheffield band, part of that family of bands that are using Western works. But the Hula connection, as we'll talk about, is really important because people like Fish, and then people like Mark Bryden, who goes on to form Moloko, they found Fawn Studios. And Fawn Studios in Sheffield becomes the next Western Works when it comes to Acid House. And that's the birthplace of Warp Records.
So you'd actually mentioned that there's an interesting approach to the catalogue of Cab Vol that divides it into kind of eras. And this one fell between the cushions of the couch for some reason.
Yeah, I agree. It is interesting. For me, it's the pinnacle of that kind of industrial era because it still has an industrial funk edge to it. And I think that it's also the period where Chris Watson leaves the band because, I mean, he, as far as I think they're all involved. It's really hard to actually differentiate between their contributions to the music. But, when it comes to like drum loops and stuff, to bring in a drummer, and then you can hear Chris's washes and he's still doing synth stuff over the top of it. But I wonder whether live work was his forte and he was really interested in doing live stuff. Yeah. I think when you bring in a drummer, it starts to kind of disrupt the dynamic a wee bit and it makes it, you become more of a kind of band. So there's some weird kind of crossover there.
For the audience's benefit here, he's somebody that went on to work really behind the scenes in the industry as like a kind of music academic, a creator, a soundtracker.
Well, he was a sound engineer at Time
yeah.
Tees. He got offered, and also you're like, you know, I've said this before in podcasts. Is it sackcloth and ashes? You're supposed to live in a fucking van for the rest of your life. You know what I mean?
He grew
It's like
up.
he got a proper job with Time Tees Television. He became a sound engineer, and as I was saying it to you upstairs, now he's on speed dial. And he's David Attenborough's sound engineer.
Yeah.
David Attenborough phones him up and says, "I found a lizard. You need to be in Patagonia in like 3 days. Can you go and record this lizard?" And he's like, "No problem, mate. I've got just the microphone." I mean, he's like internationally renowned now as a sound recordist. So he made the right choice, I think. But I think that mutant, as I said, mutant dance floor stuff. It's interesting you talk about some of those bands, you know, that came up through like, you know, the Rapture and stuff like that. You know, I was hearing that and thinking, well, you're just lifting no wave. But then, like you, I was thinking, that's just Cabaret Voltaire. You're making this tight kind of mutant funk stuff because you're taking little elements of hip hop. You've taken little elements of Parliament, but you're kind of like just punkifying it a wee bit in the same way that the pop group did.
One of the qualities of that, particularly bands like the Rapture, is that they left in the abrasiveness of the tones. Like the Rapture are actually quite a tinny, unpleasant band to listen to, given the frequencies that they leave in their guitar. But it's on purpose. It's actually quite an interesting decision, and it reflects Cabaret Voltaire, because Cabaret Voltaire, coming from that more harsh noise thing, we're quite happy having those tones in there. And I think that's quite interesting because a lot of the other movements in like, a lot of the other bands in the new rave movement were very polished, very, you know, EQ'd in, you know, to perfection. Whereas there were a few in there that you could tell came more from this school. And they did leave those harsh tones in their music, and, you know, fair fucks to them. It makes it a bit more interesting.
It's interesting at the same time that they're visiting New York, so are New Order.
Yes.
So the Cabs end up with John Robbie, New Order end up with Arthur Baker, and confusion happens, quite literally. So it is clearly a really important period to be in New York and to have the muscle of a label that are willing to kind of transport you there and use the services of something like that, that no one knew was going to end up being like, you know, incredible, you know, an incredible producer.
Well, talking about the label and the muscle of that, the success of Yashar in particular leads to the band jumping to some bizarre records and securing distro through what was then the booming Virgin label. And that union births the Crackdown in 1983, which actually placed just outside the UK top 30 and is a big step towards the mainstream. It had Flood on production duties. The Sprechgesang thing frequently, for my tastes, veers just a little bit too close to whack white guy 80s hip-hop. It's ahead of the curve, I would say, but a little bit yuck all the same. The electronics, though, are really lush. The production has clearly benefited from the new label. I don't want to be too cool for school, but the standout track in this for me is the 12th one, Moscow, which is, despite the growing coherence of the band and these albums, it's really the oppressive moments that still jump out to me, and I thought that was a brilliant dirge.
Well, you know, it came out as an album with a free 12-inch, and again, formats are really important, and Virgin Marketing knew that. I mean, as someone whose first 7-inch singles were coloured vinyl, I kind of like, I get the format and the marketing idea, and I think that they marketed the shit out of Cabaret Voltaire when they signed them. So that separate 12-inch was only a limited edition for the first few thousand copies, but it heralded the beginning of Double Vision Records, of Double Vision Records and Double Vision, the video label. So those tracks were deliberately ambient because they actually were part of the gateway of what they'd planned with taking the Virgin money and not just boosting Western works, but actually bringing in an editing suite. So those are actually visual soundtracks that they attached onto the album. The Flood album and the Flood produced album, it has to be said, and he passed away last year, but full credit to Dave Ball from Soft Cell, because he actually did all the drum programming on that album. He did a lot of the drum programming with Flood and worked very closely with Flood. And Soft Cell as well, you know, that's another band that shone very, very brightly and very, very hard for a few albums, and quite pioneering in terms of electronic stuff as much as they were lifting Suicide. So the Crackdown, it's interesting, they were taking that major label funding, they were recording some of it in Trident Studios, but they were demoing it all in Western Works. So they had this happy medium where they could DIY and get to a certain stage with their stuff, and then they could take somebody like Flood, who went on to work with U2 and
of course.
Depeche, and like incredible and really, really interesting guy if you hear him speak as well. And they could take that into, they could kind of take it into the belly of the beast. And this idea as well of them becoming almost like a video medium and really punting the idea of VHS. If you think about that period, 83, people are just starting to get those machines into their houses, Betamax and VHS machines. They're actually heralding, the media. They're becoming the media. And they're using, it's the dream, isn't it, of being an independent artist and then signing with the Man and then being able to do your own thing. And you'll give the Man the kind of, here's the pop stuff, here's the remixes, here's the 7-inch and the 12-inch mix. We've worked with Flood, we've worked in Trident, we've played the game. Now we're going to actually use that money to do our own thing, and it's still going to be experimental.
It does tick those boxes. I mean, the actual body of the album itself leaves me quite cold.
That's really interesting, because it's so worshipped as a kind of watershed at the time.
I mean, it's what I mentioned earlier on. There are periods of like evolution and there are periods of leaps, and I think that is one of the periods of the leaps, and I think I just get a little bit left behind on it. For
me, 2424 is probably their catchiest song.
Yeah,
by a good long way. It's stuck in my head right now. It's a really, really good bit of work, I think. Also quite like Talking Time. When they do the poppier moments and it's not super pop, it does really work for them. They obviously had that sensibility in them. They just didn't explore it very often.
It's interesting. I've heard people, like, since they released stuff, even I had a really good friend, Tom Donnelly, that was in the Close Lobsters. He was a massive Cabs fan, massive TG and PTV fan, early doors anyway, when Sleazy was still in the band. And I've heard him, when the next album comes out, he's like, it's just a Crackdown again. So at the time it felt like we've won. Like, it's a watermark. It's a kind of watermark. This is a high watermark. We've actually taken something quite perverse, and we've stuck it into Virgin Records at a time when Virgin were taking lots of risks. But you mentioned Some Bizarre. So Steve-O from Some Bizarre is famously the guy that got all these crazy bands over the line and into major deals. He got Mark Hammond signed. He got Soft Cell signed. He got Cabaret Voltaire signed. He got Psychic TV signed.
And clearly some of them produced absolute whirlwind hits, like amazing hits. Like, he was proven right in a lot of most
he had
cases.
a bit of that, has to be said. There was a lot of detritus as well, and he was bonkers. I mean, was it not the deal for Soft Cell was a teddy bear with a tape deck inside it, and he basically mailed it, and the record executive had to play the tape that discussed the terms, and he said, well, no one could negotiate with a fucking teddy bear. So he's quite an interesting. There's a great book about Some Bizarre. I mean, I think Steve-O shafted a lot of people as well. Coil certainly had a bit of a fucking thing with Steve-O that they never got paid. But it's because you've got Steve-O, I think, that's negotiating these deals that the bands are. It's interesting if it leaves you cold, because it felt like quite a triumph for me, because it felt like they got acknowledged as a big player. They suddenly got a bit of muscle behind them in terms of promotion, and to me they produced a pretty coherent kind of funky record that then could be marketed. I think it previews where they then go in terms of the next album, but it is also, for me, it felt like a wee bit of a relief, because it felt like otherwise they were just going to meander around in this indie vortex. I can
absolutely see that. Like how they could have got a little bit lost in the wilderness of like experimentation without that greater focus. You've alluded to it, Micro-Phonies, the 1984 album. What a terrible title.
Absolutely.
October 1984, and I have to say I'm not at all convinced by this record either. Is the production even any better than the Crackdown? I'm also not sure that it is. And musically, I found it a bit of a slog. I thought the third track in it, Digital Rasta, there's some really great momentary ARP pushes, but I think the overall track plods, and that sort of sums up the album for me in general. There's some excellent moments like that, cerebrally I'm like, oh wow, that is a brilliant, beautiful little bit of like modulation or performance. But overall, it's so bogged down by itself. I really couldn't chime with it at all.
It's interesting that Flood, I mean, this is the point where Flood kind of, he uses this as a calling card to end up working with 9 Inch Nails. Like Trent Reznor's like, you did the Crackdown,
I'm not
so
surprised.
it's really interesting that industrial, what becomes industrial music, which is the American version of industrial, It's interesting. They're kind of craving that kind of polish. Again, I think Sensoria and Do Right absolutely dominate this whole album.
Sensoria is a big one for them.
And Sensoria is the one. Again, they're still working with Peter Kay, as they did on the videos for the singles from the Crackdown. But it's the Sensoria video that ends up in the Museum of Modern Art. And all he did was take a boom that kind of, did a 180, stuck a camera on it, but created these kind of like weird effects that nobody was really doing at the time. So I think that's also a really interesting point. The Cabs want to be like almost like a video production company that happens to make music that's funded by a major record label. And then,
That's like the start of their career, though. The music's incidental. We're a performance art company that makes music on the side. Yeah,
I think that's a very familiar industrial story, but it's like, what happens when you take the money? You've got to do 3 albums for Virgin, and you do them. But I think what changed is they used Flood, but I do think that you've then got to some extent, it's looser. It's still got a bit of groove to it, but it feels like a wee bit of an afterthought because Sensoria is such a banger.
So they decide to jump.
I was going to say, I really like Spies in the Wires in that one.
Spies in the Wires really dubby.
It's a really good. I really like that song. But Sensoria is the one. It's probably maybe their best song. Maybe
so good they did it twice.
Yeah.
Because Do Right is kind of a version, and again they're kind of being slightly subversive and being like, well, here it is, but it's not, and here it is at the end. Here's a touch of evil at the beginning of Red Mecca. Here's a refrain at the end of it, and they're kind of curating themselves in a weird way. I mean, I think the difference here is that Peter Kay, who ends up doing Depeche videos, he ends up doing like stuff for Killing Joke. He does the Love Like Blood video for Killing Joke and Bananarama and stuff, you've got that, but at the same time they're working with Fairlights. They're starting to get Fairlights and Sinclaviers on board. So I think it's Flood's kind of experimenting at this period and setting himself up for becoming the producer that he ends up being. He's learning his craft. Dave Ball from Soft Cells kind of helping him a bit with the drum programming. So I think the albums both are still kind of experimental in a studio sense, but not experimental musically.
No,
they're quite traditional musically, and for a band like that to kind of go into a techno pop period is, it was quite shocking at the time. But you're kind of rooting for them as well, because you would rather see them on Top of the Pops than God love them. Blancmange are lovely, but you'd want to see Cabaret Voltaire on Top of the Pops.
I think it's also what kind of greases the wheels for them moving to EMI. It gives them access to Adrian Sherwood in the process, who's just been working on Twitch by Ministry.
That's right. That is a connection with Ministry as well.
Actually, amazing effect as well. Like really.
I mean, Sherwood, what a set of years.
Yeah. So they're actually ultimately between themselves and Ministry, and maybe at the most a couple of others, helping to create the definitive industrial sound at that point. And it leads to the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord in '85. Is this the critics' choice Cabaret Voltaire album potentially?
No, I would say it's overlooked. I actually consider this as an unsung because it's kind of slithered out.
I mean, I think it's a fairly definitive record.
It's actually the name comes from a right-wing militia group.
A Christian
militia group. Yeah,
Christian nationalists, so, which you're talking about foreshadowing the problems of our current political climate. Christian nationalism being a big theme, and it's something that reoccurs all the way through their career. They're fascinated by the intersection of religiosity and government and authoritarianism, really.
Yeah, and that's a Dadaist perspective as well, I think. But it feels like what they returned to, I think it absolutely flopped. But it was a contractual obligation, and I think there's a bit of a fuck you that they actually brought in some of the samples that they did and that they chose, and the titles that they chose were kind of bringing in a bit of like, well, actually, we're going to suit ourselves. We're going to record this in Western Works. We're going to do our own thing. We're going to bring in Charles Manson kind of samples. It's quite a famous Charles Manson documentary. We're going to kind of, to me, we're going to we're going to prove that we're not shiny pop. We're going to get over this and fulfill our contract. But at the same time, there's some great stuff. I mean, on it.
I think it's a very strong album.
The Web's a great track.
Yeah. We mentioned this earlier on. They're a duo at this point as well. We spoke about how Red Mecca tends to get like very good ratings on the likes of Rate Your Music and that, but maybe it's more that I'm seeing it in the reappraisals, but the critical reappraisals of this album are very, very hot for it. Like
Interesting.
Over time, I think it's aged very well,
Aye.
and people have gone back to the to basically the edgelordiness of the album, and
I think that's what they brought back.
It's the right side of provocativeness, and without overstepping. It's a really, really interesting album musically as well as thematically. By the way, they couldn't release it as The Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord in the States. They had to shorten it to The Arm of the Lord, only to get it sold because of the militia. The second one, I Want You, slipped in as a single despite the fact that it's a masturbation song. Like the whole track's about masturbation, and
It's a great
that
song.
that was a fuck
Great
you
video
by
as
them,
well.
wasn't it?
Peter Kerr did a great job on that video. Really frightening looking video.
The title track, Arm of the Lord, number 5, the brooding ambience, is for me another understated highlight, referring back to Moscow. When they're dark and low, they're incredible.
That's the one with the Manson, dialogue.
Yeah. I think
The Charles Manson
yeah,
dialogue, yeah.
And the 6th track, Warm, is a surefire dance floor belter in the naughty clubs at the time. Like, really sexy tune.
I think it's really great that you've tapped into it, because I did consider this as the unsung.
Yeah.
I think it's strongly overlooked, but it felt to me like they'd maybe spread themselves a bit thinly, because simultaneously they bring out Drinking Gasoline.
Gasoline in Your Eye, kind of.
Well, Drinking Gasoline is the double 12-inch thing that they bring out with like quite extended tracks, but it's previews Gasoline in Your Eye.
And they're working on is it Earthshaker? Is that what it was called?
Earthshaker was kind of going to be a soundtrack thing that never
never
really
appeared.
It never really appeared.
Yeah,
I don't know if
that's
that
right.
was with Peter Kerr.
And I think Gasoline in Your Eye includes some of the music that was meant to be on that.
So they made this long form video. It's like a 2-hour long VHS cassette that you could mail order from Virgin. But at the same time, it's basically funding Double Vision as a video label. And they bring out a retrospective of their own kind of video material that they've been kind of squirreling away, and they'd been filming over the years. So I think this is the kind of, they've kind of shed their kind of edgy, difficult artist thing with Virgin, and they've kind of revealed themselves to actually still be quite an art project, and they've opened up, and that's actually probably been quite tantalising for Virgin, because there's not that many bands that were doing this at the time and saying, actually, here's a 2-hour long form video of what we're doing. Get it on MTV, which hadn't even happened yet. But they're kind of predicting the media and predicting the future and how they're moving forward. But it feels like it's kind of spread out a wee bit thinly. They may be taking on a bit too much. The other thing, they changed their drummer as well. So it's Mark Tattersall of a band called Chak, who were a great Sheffield funk band. Look up a track called Out of the Flesh that got shown on the Tube. Really, really aggressive, funky band. But that's who founds Fawn Studios.
Right.
And Fawn Studios becomes...
It's my local...
Well, prior to that, that's where all the acid house bands are forming. That's where Robert Gordon works. That's basically where Warp Records ends up becoming created eventually. But it was a kind of go-to. And I think it became everything that Western Works should have been, but with a bit of money.
Right, aye. So the next album release is Code in 87.
Yep.
And for me, I mean, Mark, I said this to you as soon as I listened to it. It was absolutely planted between Prince and early Nine Inch Nails.
Prince Alarm.
Yeah, Prince Alarm, there you go. Touches of Depeche Mode in the synth production, because it's quite a slick album. I think tracks like Sex Money Freaks, the second one, stand out 80s dark funk pop. I also think, this may be controversial, but the 6th track, White Car, with those guitar swipes, for me foreshadows White Zombie.
Interesting.
Right? So when you listen to that, it's got a playful campiness to it, but an aggression that if you turbocharge the production the way that, you know, the White Zombie were, or Rob Zombie for that matter, but more White Zombie, it really sounds like a proto version of that to me. But it's also around this time that the band members start to drift personally and creatively. So this is just prior to that when this comes out. I thought Code was a really interesting album.
I think it's underrated. I mean, I don't think it's unsung. It's not as available as it could be. I think the switch from Virgin over to EMI Parlophone clearly took a bit of time
Mm-hmm.
And they're still banging out singles and still doing collaborations. They're
Because
still
there's
building the
almost 2
studio.
years that passes. Which
Yeah,
is
there's a slight delay, and I think that's maybe also it's getting your editing suite involved, and it's like getting the label, getting Double Vision set up. I mean, the Double Vision catalog's really interesting as well. You know, they're bringing out the box, which is what happens after Clock DVA implodes. The box is formed, and you've got you've got Lydia Lunch stuff coming out. You've got really interesting stuff coming out on the label, which again Paul Smith is in the mix of kind of helping them create. So they got distracted, I think, in doing that. But to work with Sherwood at a time, if you think about that mid to late 80s period, like on New Sound stuff, I was going to the QM to see stuff, and Sherwood is he's the go-to. So they pick a smart producer.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that the album as it stands necessarily holds up in the way that actually some of the remixes and some of the spin-offs. So Aidan Sherwood kind of remixes stuff. You got Francois Kevorkian starts to remix stuff. They go back to John Robbie to remix stuff. So I think they've got their eye to we're going to sell an album, but they're also keeping an eye to the dance floor, and they're keeping an eye to where these remixes can end up in literally across the world and as part of this emerging culture.
I get a wee bit of the sense though that delay, things do start to unravel very slightly here. I mean, one of them ends up living in London. The other one is in Sheffield, which is an initial sort of geographical kind of distance, which is obviously amplified hugely in future years. They sell the studio out of financial necessity at the time. I think the musical identity starts to come into question of the band a bit. And so as much as there are other good reasons for that delay, there is a sense of a little bit of a sudden loss of momentum in what they're doing. So partly due to the physical distance as well, but also a bit creatively, the solo records start to gain a bit more priority amongst the members, especially Richard. This actually leads to interactions with Warp Records. His solo stuff kind of opens that door. Warp end up releasing a compilation, Listen Up, with Cabaret Voltaire in 1990, which is a collection
Listen Ups. I think Mute released Listen Up. It's not Warp, yeah.
Oh,
Mute released Listen Up.
Mute.
So there's a retrospective, and I think you're right. They maybe start selling the crown jewels. They go to Mute.
Yeah,
and Daniel,
Mute,
obviously being a huge fan, and Mute start a reissue campaign.
Right.
I mean, it leads up to this compilation that we're going to talk about, because Rough Trade kind of did the same thing. And there's a wee bit of a reevaluation. It's like, okay, they've got a major record deal, but what about all this other stuff?
Yeah.
And I think they must have had a hand in that to say, you know what, they're not selling the crown jewels, but they're a bit like, actually, we've got all of this stuff as well as this new record.
I think it's still held in quite high esteem, that collection. It seems.
I think Code's definitely due a reevaluation and due a reissue. The trouble is, it's kind of tied up, and it'll be tied up in knots with EMI. But it felt to me as if
Listen Up as well, though, I think is
the compilation's great because it goes way back. It goes way back into the factory period and stuff, and it really starts to kind of reevaluate. It's basically a collection of like leftovers and B-sides, and it all needed to be kind of pulled together. But that also,
but the quality is there in it.
Oh, but that also opens up that Mute Records had, the Grey Area was a sub-label of Mute Records that brought out, SPK stuff, Throbbing Gristle stuff. And, they had this Cabaret Voltaire back catalogue. I think the slight perversion that's still there, though, and the use of, the use of US propaganda, particularly, Here to Go is a William Burroughs quote, is a direct William Burroughs quote. The Don't Argue, they're using, anti-communist propaganda from US broadcasts. So they're like, we've still got that little edge to us. And it feels like they're still kind of manoeuvring their way around. And then it feels like when they move on, they kind of get swallowed up by the machine.
I would say Don't Argue is another track in that stood out for me.
It's a great track.
Really good song.
And the video, again, they're traveling the world. They've got a budget. They're kind of filming stuff. Kirk particularly is never, always got a camera in his hand. And they're using that kind of like filtered Super 8 thing and sticking it through digital media and actually doing something quite refreshing that ends up on like the chart show on a Saturday morning, in Glasgow.
So there's another big jump in sound that comes with Groovy, Laidback and Nasty in 1990. They worked with Chicago house producer Marshall Jefferson, and I think the record really leans into that. It's interesting, actually. Funnily enough, they were trying to work with kind of New York City hip-hop legend Todd Terry and were unable to get hold of him, as I understand it. I think this record is painfully 90s with the sort of dance piano, big soul, female backing vocal, program bass, all that kind of stuff. Some reviews described it as sounding dated even as it was released.
Yeah. I think what you've got there is a very fast dragon that you needed to jump onto, and they missed it.
Yeah.
And it ends up sounding like a kind of bland version of The Beloved. And at points I I think they worked their arse off trying to deliver another record for EMI, and they were running about and interested. It's interesting for me. They're really interested in Chicago, where actually they should probably have been in Detroit.
Yeah, it's a little bit hard for me to square this record with the band of '76, or indeed even the band of '82. It's just there's something really unremarkable about it to me, you know. I mean, it's remarkable in how much it's different from their other material, but just listening to it cold, I'm like, this just does not do anything exciting for me at all.
So smooth and coffee table.
Yeah, I would say that from this record until the present day, it's all unlistenable for me. All of it is unlistenable.
I can understand that, knowing your kind of habits. The third track on it, Minute by Minute, I mean, if you're into stinky 1990s kitsch, dig that tune out in particular. But yeah, I mean, the band racked up a power of debt under EMI and they were eventually dropped. That meant returning to work with Les Disques de Crépuscule that we spoke about in Belgium.
It is interesting because I think the as you say, they I don't know what their contract was with Parlophone, but they worked their arse off, but at the same time they were, you know, Mal does this Love Street thing with Dave Ball. Look at that video on YouTube, and he's got a little wee pair of shorts on and stuff, and it's like, but it's because Crush, House Arrest, was I think it was maybe a number one, a massive banger, and it was recorded at Fawn.
Oh, right, okay.
So they were also at the same time they're keeping an eye to what's happening with the emerging scene, particularly in the north of England, which is like Bleep. You know, Bleep House and bands like LFO, Nightmares on Wax, that's all starting. Yeah. They're all starting to kind of coalesce around Warp Records. So I think they were like, well, we've got this kind of funding, we can afford a video, and we'll try and kind of get on that wave. So I think Mal's got one eye to that, whereas Richard's still got an eye to working with, you know, DJ Parrott and doing Sweet Exorcist and Begins Warp Records, the first release on Warp Records. So I think they're at a bit of a kind of conjuncture. You know, they're keeping a wee eye to things like what a guy called Gerald are doing or 808 State are doing, but it feels like they're really out of their depth.
Well, it's that thing about leading and following.
They're very much following
when it starts to flip. I mean, Body and Soul 91 is the last record with Stephen Melinder on vocals. It's a bit of a no man's land of 90s dance pop. You know, it does sport some of their kind of darker, more dialed back tendencies, but it really ends up as a bit of a meh. It's not aged well, in my opinion, for anything other than irony. I think the second track, Shout, is a howling example of sounding dated even as you're dropping new music. And, you know, Mark, you've spoken about this. Things kind of accelerate into a wee bit of a blur here because the band entered into an agreement with Mute that involved a compilation of their own early releases as well as 3 more albums. These were Plasticity, International Language and The Conversation, all effectively 90s dance records. I think fans even will debate their merits. It's not a sound I need a lot of in my life, but, you know, Phil, maybe you can tell us where it sat in terms of actual quality in that scene. But I mean, I have seen writers say that they were some of the better purveyors of that sound at the time.
Well, they're working with Robert Gordon again, and Kirk's got a project called Zone with Robert Gordon. So I think I experienced it. They DIY'd it, really. So Plastics, they had the deal with Les Disques de Crépuscule, and then they set up their own label Plastics, and they kind of DIY'd it. At the same time, they were working with Mute, and they were doing the reissue series. I think it's very informed by, you know, like a guy called Gerald, that kind of period of acid house, and they were trying to kind of, to me, it's like if Groovy, Laidback and Nasty had been as stripped down as this, it might have been a slightly more interesting record. I think that they were trying to kind of prove a point as to where they were trying to kind of reach for it. To me, the standout tracks on that record are actually the weird ambient ones that go into kind of like weird dubby fuzz.
It's Richard, really, isn't it? At this point, it's like,
predominantly it is. I'm not sure how much. It's very hard to kind of compute who's involved with
as
what.
With so much other stuff, it's hard to tell.
But it's interesting. I mean, I saw them in Edinburgh in this period in 1990 at Carlton Studios.
Oh wow! Okay.
So and was, you know, thrilled and underwhelmed with equal measure.
We've all been there.
Because it was like finally I get to see them, but probably at
the wrong
the wrong period in time. So it was interesting, but I think Decay in Westernland, which again is a William Burroughs reference, that points to them kind of still having that little kind of eye to the art, but they were just so compelled to still continue to attempt to this kind of like house music, which by 1991, rave was over.
Yeah.
You know, it was again they're kind
Again,
of following
leading and
rather than
following.
leading.
Yeah. So there's a massive gap in their career at this point, effectively, right? It's not really until, was it 2014, something like that? Kirk had agreed to appear at, was it Berlin, a tonal festival, I think it was, for his first gig in about 20 years. It was just him now, with banks of machines and lots of visuals. He did play more shows with new material in 2015 and 2016. He did stuff. Despite Coachella offering supposedly really good cash, he refused to reform the old lineup, citing his reluctance to become a nostalgia project.
Which I think that was the Cocteau Twins' answer as well.
Good on them. And he went on to release 4 more records of original music. That's Shadow of Fear and Shadow of Funk in 2020, and then Decadrone and Benign Drone.
Yeah, there's an album and a few EPs at the end where he's kind of like lifted the name.
I mean, the EPs are like 1 track of an hour of music.
Oh yeah. No,
Long,
there's a bulk of material. I mean, I think that kind of ambient period with, you know, the Plastics period. The only thing I would point out is certainly the plasticity. I think stands up, and it's still very collectible. There's a great kind of couple of samples from a documentary about a Samoan drug gang. My Crazy Life, which are again, it's back to that kind of, you know, that sense of, because they were always really interested in,
as well.
They're kind of they're still kind of interested in that. The thing that they also did was they upcycled the original sample from The Outer Limits from Yasha. And used it on that track that unintentionally ended up on a repress of a Taylor Swift record.
That's right, of course. And this is when the TikTokers were extremely confused by what's going on.
There's a beautiful bit of footage. So it was actually a compilation of kind of early house stuff and kind of ambient stuff that came out, and they'd used that track. And there's a fabulous footage, and it's a beautiful magenta.
What Taylor Swift, what album was it?
Hang on, I'll tell you. It was the one that's it was her version. She'd redone her version.
That's right. Aye.
I'll find it.
We're not particularly au fait in Taylor Swift.
No, believe me, no. Oh no, that's it. It's actually it's Speak Now.
Right.
So I'm not au fait with her either, I have to say. But it was intended for a compilation called Happy Land, a compendium of alternative electronic music from the British Isles between 92 and 96. So, which was due to come out, but the pressing plant got them confused. And this poor Taylor Swift fan ended up putting on the needle, and it said there's 70 billion people on Earth, where are they hiding? Over and over again. And then it turns into, it's not Yasha, but it turns into a different track. And she's staring down the camera lens like, I think my record player's haunted. Like, it's a beautiful moment where actually, ironically, again, at a period where they're kind of down at heel as a band, like, you just don't know what you're going to stick out in the universe, and then it comes back to you 20 years later. As a beautiful form of subversion.
Yeah.
There's not much else. I mean, I think there's good Black Panther samples on the international language, it has to be said. Some of it's taken from John Lydon's acting debut film. It was called Cop Killer, but not in the US, I think. But there's not much else to say, really. It's very much Kirk's thing. It's an extension. At the same time, as you've said, he's built up this whole bank of solo stuff.
Oh man!
And I think it all starts to merge.
As you said, there's compilation albums where it's actually all him under different monikers.
Under 20 different monikers.
I mean, those 4 records are a mixed bag. I mean, the first one, unorthodox machine noise and an unfussiness that I think recalls the really earliest days. There's also like sort of moments of production that seem really trapped in that 90s period and a bit anachronistic. There was a renewed sense of menace, I think, that totally abandoned the smoothness of and I say smooth with a V there, of the 80s and 90s. Shadow of Funk, I think, feels the most interesting and balanced between sinister, structured and musical. And as I said, the latter 2 releases are 1 track, 1 hour long monsters of noise that actually in a weird way summon the spirit of 3 Mantras, you know, that willingness to do long, protracted, challenging things. And it's kind of nice in a way to see them come full circle and produce something so dangerous again. I
think that's what he did with it in a way when he came back and he used the name, you know. I mean, Mal's in Perth. You know, Mal's got his own record label, he's got his own bands, he's doing his own thing. He's within his rights to use the name. But I think it became it's different from the solo stuff in terms of its longevity, in terms of it kind of endurance pieces.
Yeah,
I would say in performance art, it's like it becomes an endurance project.
Yeah.
And he's using the same, you know, 3 visuals, kind of cubes and stuff, and like projecting all these images around, and he's lifting and laying lots of media. So it's still in there, and it's a lot of what he probably brought. I would say probably early doors Chris brought to what Cabaret Voltaire were. And that's fine, but a lot of us kind of like were like, well, I think you're just using the legacy, you know.
Yeah, which is something that he'd been so sheepish about doing. Sadly, Richard Kirk died in 2021, just shortly after the release of the B9 Drone record.
Yeah.
Since then, Mal and Chris Watson have resurrected the band name to perform, first at a festival in 2025, and very shortly for a final tour in 2026. I think it's October they're playing here.
They said it's the final UK tour, because they're in the States.
Oh, goodness.
They're in the States, and I think they're going to Australia. So I'm not sure Chris can make all of the dates, because you never know when David Attenborough wants a tsetse fly to be recorded
pristinely.
But having seen them, I saw the Sheffield show. I was at the Sheffield show, which is their first gig, and they immediately dedicated it to Richard.
Yeah,
and and they're very honouring of the legacy, and it's just beautiful to see Chris Watson on stage making fucking weird noises.
Mal's actually spoken about it. He actually spoke about as to whether or not a reunion could have happened with Richard if he'd still been alive. He said, I don't know, Richard had gone down his own path. I always wanted to think a full reunion could happen, but I can't second guess how Richard would have reacted to the idea. He'd become quite reclusive, and he had developed his own specific way of doing things. And in terms of the posthumous shows, he said, even though he's not playing in these shows, we've managed to sort of redo the parts he did. Richard's completely embedded in what we do, and it's done very much to acknowledge the work he did.
It's done with love,
yeah,
you know. But also, I think Richard really just retreated into his house with a massive bag of weed and an Amiga, and made
the Amiga.
Huge,
I love the fact he was using.
He loved
Amiga.
his Amiga, and he's just a huge canon of solo stuff. Some of which it all gets a bit repetitive. But I would definitely point to Sandos as his solo
seems
projects.
to be one of the standouts, yeah, and
both for kind of techno stuff, but also definitely for dub, because he deconstructed a lot of heavy dub stuff and brought out a couple of albums on Soul Wax.
The quality
and the
of
Sandos project's amazing.
The quality of the production on it as well is fairly, unimpeachable. Just before we actually discuss the album itself, I do just want to take a moment to appreciate the fairly outsider art nature of both the earliest and, as I mentioned, the very latest Cabaret Voltaire releases. And I do want to get both your thoughts here. So Cabaret Voltaire didn't really stay in the 74 to 76 place. We've established that, right? Their music gained more structure, and you could perhaps call it sophistication. There is a genuine sense of exploration and honesty in that early stuff that I think is worthy of admiration, put it that way. Personally, I remember that. And listening to this stuff and listening to that release regarding the early years, it was actually a really thought-provoking exercise for me, because I do remember making home tapes and having that, we spoke about the lack of ego, that total disregard for expectation or convention. And I lost that. And I think my naivety got tempered, maybe even sullied by, I hesitate to say it, but I think it might be true, a sense of ambition, or a notion of purpose. And listening back to those tapes of that mad stuff I did in the early days, as much as they are really whimsical and often really quite silly, I do wonder if they aren't the most honest music that I ever made. So go with me here. All these years of trying to develop a sound in bands, have I actually been straying further and further from the most honest noises that I ever made? As unpalatable as they may have been. I mean, Phil, I'm dropping a couple of names here, but for people in Glasgow, hopefully this has some relevance. I have to admit to being envious of guys like maybe Ger Reid or Ian Campbell, who have stayed far truer to that original sensibility within themselves than I ever could. I just don't have that ability, to get to suppress that ego in that way. On one hand, I do see people that play that kind of stuff, and there's a bit of a, oh, okay, that's unusual. you know, in a very sort of removed and observational way.
I regularly visit Planet Fritz Welsh, and I love Fritz to bits.
So
But it's not. I mean, there will be a canon of work, but because he's an artist. But there, you know, it's not something you could like just play to your nephew and be like, oh, what about this then, eh?
And there's kind of a duality there where I'm watching it going, it's pretty out there, you know.
Yeah.
But at the same time, that tells me that they have the confidence to follow that through, to do that. And I kind of feel like I've internalized my own oppression, you know, when it comes to my own conformity.
I think the Cabs are a lesson in kind of entering into the belly of the beast and trying to remain intact.
And the fact that they live with it, and not only live with it, then platformed it with re-releases. And, you know, I do look on all those years of trying to form a more sophisticated sound and develop an identity, which really is just a brand, I suppose. And what were the results of that? And they were actually probably quite mediocre. And I'm not trying to say that as like false modesty or anything, you know. Even if that original music was also extremely mediocre, it was totally sincere. And I do wonder if that wasn't actually ultimately a little bit more admirable. So I'm sort of curious, like, have you revisited your most naive moments and reflected on how perhaps, you know, the pressures of the world sort of influenced how honest your later productions were? Because I certainly feel guilty of that.
I've digitized a cassette for Richie, for me and Richie Dempsey, of really early experiments in the studio, tape experiments. We would take, you know, Richie Dempsey used to go to gigs with a Rukinor bag with a double cassette like boogie box in it and bootleg gigs and literally show it to the bouncers on the way in the door. And he actually used to have loads of gigs bootlegged. But we would also do like little field recordings and little skits, and we used to call them bus shelter bashes, and we would just go out and fucking hit things and scream and go up hills and just scream our heads off and tape it and then you know, fuck about with it. And I found a cassette of all that stuff, sent it to Richie, and it was so funny. Yeah, it was so funny, and it's just we guys in Erskine like just kind of slightly losing their minds and just fucking about with noise. At a time, you know, obviously I loved SPK, but I was never going to be SPK, you know. But I could get a couple of drumsticks and we could hit a bus shelter and make a kind of horrible thunderous noise, stick it on a cassette, and then kind of like play it backwards or cut it up. So we were absolutely doing those little kind of experiments ourselves, just for a laugh, just a bunch of guys hanging about. Everybody does it on their phone now, so I can see that, and then. You know, and then many years later, I'm emailing a lawyer at BMG Records asking for the Stretchheads tapes back. You know, because and believe me, we were not kind of part of any corporate anything. I mean, we were still quite outsider and weird even when we did that. But as I said, because we'd gone through the gate of Blast First, we suddenly become part of this world that we never really wanted to be. And I don't know if there was a question of conformity and I don't think we ever made a conformist decision in our life. I think we just kind of did what we did and had a laugh. You know, yeah, we thought about formats, you know, like let's do a 12-inch dub mix of that for a laugh. But we were literally just pissing ourselves in the studio.
I do think we all take on board, whether knowingly or otherwise, we take on board the influences and pressures. It's an overly severe word, but yeah, I think we are. The gravity exerts a force on us of expectation. I
think there's a wee bit of that. I said that each gig's unique because it's not about us, it's about the audience. And, you know, I wanted it to be very much on the level from an early doors, and I never gave up my day job. I had no intention of giving up psychiatry and working in my day job, not just because that was actually a really useful security and an inspiration at times, but because I had no ambitions of us. If we could, I had no ambitions of making money. I've never had any ambition of making money out of music. I think someone like Jer, who's very much a kindred spirit, I mean, he has made money. He has been able to find a way in the art world of making money. He cuts his cloth and he works with people that he loves, and he, you know, and I've worked with him, I've collaborated with him. One of the first things I ever did as a kind of, not as a solo performer, but one of the first things that kind of got me back into doing live work was with Jer. And it was like December 22nd, like, you know, like absolute minus fucking 3 degrees in the basement of Stereo with like 4 people there. and and we brought out a cassette together. So there's something kindred a bit about that playfulness and experimentation that I don't feel that I've necessarily lost. I mean, yes, I'm in a band with people that were in certain other bands, but I've got absolutely no commercial ambitions whatsoever. But I totally get the more that you have contact with those expectations, either from your audience or from the mechanisms that you use to get your stuff out, then you're going to be susceptible to that. And I think this is a lesson in still holding on to your integrity. It has to be said, both Chris and Mal I have met are the sweetest, most enthusiastic, lovely, unscathed guys, because they both found a route to take this art material and this music material and kind of cast it off and just get into academia and get into what they really loved. Richard Kirk stayed, no man is an island, but he was a fucking island. He just steered his path.
Sailed on.
And had fuck all to do with anybody else.
Weirdly, they're an example of both, because they have this incredible honesty and nakedness and releasing stuff that is otherwise quite, very lo-fi and very ad hoc. But then they also, clearly the gravity exerts itself all the way up to their EMI kind of years, where they're actually releasing smooth pop, and you're like, geez, it's really fascinating, the journey. But
they were like 5 years too late. Soft Cell did that.
How about you, Mark? Do you remember your earliest?
Yeah, I mean,
dabblings?
I think about this quite a lot, honestly. Like, I think the idea of trying to refine something so that it becomes like the most sincere expression, the most pure expression of what you've been trying to achieve as an artist, comes with you like shoring off all those little jagged edges, all the little, but in doing that, all the anachronisms as well, which kind of makes it quite odd, and I think there's part of you that wants to get taken seriously, quote unquote seriously, right?
Yeah.
And in doing that, you think you need to like just get rid of all the bullshit, or the childish bullshit, But in doing so, we also lose the ability to play, like fully, properly play.
Are we going to use the word innocence here? But can I broach
I think it's the difference between seriousness and sincerity. So you can be sincerely fucking funny about it and not take it seriously.
Yeah,
you can be fucking serious about being playful as well. So I think you're onto like a little bit of a kind of a wee Venn diagram there, and it's quite hard to steer. And then when there are forces, I think timing is so critical, and it's clear in this trajectory that 3 months earlier that might have worked, and art and music is in such flux, and now the technology that they were predicting has absolutely captured us all, and we're all behind, because the technology and AI is what's in advance. So but it just shows you, in their case, what a difference a few months would make. In our case, what a difference a week will make.
Yeah, well, that's true. Time has certainly sped up.
I would say as well that the reverse of that is that you do actually become more refined as an artist. You start to create higher quality work. So there's a trade-off to be had there.
I guess I'm just querying,
because
that refinement, how much of it is an actual natural process, and how much of it is an unwitting absorption of the lessons of the world and the industry and the expectations around you. That's what I'm saying. I'm not saying it's a conscious thing. I'm not saying you decide one day, fuck that, I'm just going to write this to try and make money. I'm just saying I think we do unwittingly feel those things shape us like tidal forces.
Well, I think they must, because if you start spending more of your time coming into contact with more quote unquote commercial art, then it's going to become a bigger part of your identity.
Especially if you see a reward structure that whether you've realised it or not, that incentivizes certain behaviours and creative decisions.
There's a trade-off, and I think you're constantly trading off. The fact that you've got a major record label involved and you've got all of that machine to fucking deal with, first thing you need is a manager to deal with all that. Even if it's somebody like Steve-O or or Paul Smith, who could they could write a book about Paul. He's been sacked by most of the bands he's worked for, right? So as soon as he's sent his, basically he said, as soon as he sent his invoice for his 15%, he gets sacked. But so you need you need a bit of protection, but at the same time you can take that platform and then you can feed all these independent labels. And if you look at a compilation like Listen Up, their tracks were appearing in all these tiny little labels, and they were sharing love.
I think that's why they're such an interesting example of both scenarios.
Yeah, you can be both.
They lived both. And actually, to get to the record itself, one of the reasons I think this is such a compelling choice is because this record, 8 Crepuscule tracks, 1987 release, is both to me. It's such an interesting juncture, and it documents these extremes of the band.
Yeah.
You know, it's got some incredibly accessible stuff, and it's got some very inaccessible stuff, and there's a naivety about it that I think seems quite honest, and that's why I wasn't sure about your choice as I was listening, but as this all came together and these thoughts coalesced, it did start to make a lot of sense, because it in many ways tells the story of the band in a very sort of succinct form.
It feels
Which,
like
by
a
the
nice
way,
capsule.
this podcast is not.
No. But Mark, you know, you'd said at the beginning as well, you know, the idea of a kind of compilation. I didn't want to breach the the rules, but I suppose this is a band that kind of curates itself, and then they kind of created this label, curated a little capsule as part of it. And there will be, you know, you don't want to get into you know, my favourite album is the best of the Beatles.
Yeah.
But, you know, there is a thing, absolutely, and this is not by any means the best of Cabaret Voltaire. No. It's curated with quite a distinct eye to the timeline and to that label and to that period. But it just feels like a wee bit of a juncture. It's a transitional object.
Yeah, I was going to say, so to your point you're making there, like choosing a compilation or a live album is something that never used to be something that we would do. But that's exactly what you just said, exactly the thing, right? It's like this is not just like it's not a best of, and it's also a snapshot of a period in time of a lot of tracks that were never brought together and were never actually designed to be brought together in this way either, you know? And the fact they hang together so well is actually a testament to a vision they have.
Well, good.
You know, because you used the word paranoid earlier, and that's the best way to describe them. When I was speaking to my partner about it the other day, I was like, they make me feel paranoid, like, because they just have that sense of deep unease for the vast majority of their catalogue. That all these songs have that in common as well, but they're also, all the songs in this record are underpinned by funk. Every single one, apart from the second song, which is mostly just ambient and weird, but the rest of it is, and the fact that it ends with the theme from Shaft actually pulls all that, it pulls that whole theme together. You know, it kind of ties a nice bow on it, and you're kind of thinking, did you think about it in this way when you compiled it as well? Because that tells me there's some kind of meta thinking.
But in interviews
put together,
interviews, they're saying they love George Clinton. They're saying that they love, you know, they love Miles Davis. You know, Electric Period. They love, you know, Bringing the Voodoo Down. And, you know, Kirk uses that as an album, as a record title at one point as well. Kirk Brings the Voodoo Down. So they're championing their love of black music, which I think comes from them being skinheads. Yeah, like original skinheads.
So can we emphasise the potential unsung credentials of this as well, in the sense that it's not on major streaming platforms, which is...
Yeah, it is. I've listened to it on Spotify.
It wasn't under the Cabaret Voltaire catalogue.
It absolutely was on Spotify.
It'd be interesting if it has turned up there.
Really?
Because it's not associated with Mute or anything like that.
I didn't think so either.
Unless Crepuscule and James Nice has done something around that.
All right, well, there
Stick
you go.
it up. It's on YouTube.
Yeah.
It was YouTube that I had to go to get it, but there you go. That would be a biggie in terms of keeping it alive. It's availability. It's, you know, how much it's propagated.
I mean, the vinyl and the CD versions changed hands for lots of money because it kind of sank without a trace.
In terms of the tracks, Slugging for Jesus makes up the first 3. Slugging for Jesus Part 1. I mean, we talked about the band's fascination with evangelism and Christian nationalism. It manifests again here. You talked about, you mentioned this earlier on, My Life in the Bush of Ghosts with David Byrne and Brian Eno. That's an immediate conversation when this track gets raised, because that David Byrne, Brian Eno collaboration appeared in 1981 and was often compared, if not outright accused, of ripping off this track.
Absolutely.
And especially tracks on it like Jezebel Spirit, which basically sounds like a hi-fi reworking of this piece of music. But Mal has waved that away. He says that anybody playing in the USA, for example, at the time was always confronted by the explosion of televangelist channels. And given that, you know, Brian Eno was an influence in them, and to some extent as well, they were exploring similar areas of music. It's totally natural.
I think they were kind of in the same territory. You know that My Life in the Bush of Ghosts has a US version and a UK version?
No, I didn't know that. No.
Because actually, is it a Council of Islam in UK protested as one of the tracks sampled as a track called Quran, and they'd sampled, and you're not allowed to do that. So they sampled a prayer. So there's a different track. Mountain of Needles, I think, is on the UK version of that album instead. So Eno came up against some heat, but he had the beauty of Island Records to kind of just do a different pressing. I mean, I think they're in a very similar, because Yashar kind of heralds this a wee bit as well with its use, but it's not a sample. It's apparently it's a sped up male vocal. That's what I read on a Reddit, that they were just manipulating tapes. It wasn't taken from anything kind of religious.
So I think for techie kind of types, the Electro-Harmonix drum machines were the backbone for these first 3 tracks. And according to Mal, that's because they were fat and basic. And it is a really sort of solid spine to the tunes. The second one, Slugging for Jesus Part 2, caustic, and I think you'd referred to it as ambient. I think it's a very harsh ambient, designed to unsettle. It's the most avant-garde slice of this collection. I think it's dripping with cynicism, actually. It seems,
it's nasty.
Fueled by that religious grifting overlay that it's got.
I think, as Mark says, it's that air of paranoia. So, in part 1, because part 1 and part 2 came out on 112 with Your Agent Man, which we'll get to, and then part 3 comes out on a different EP. So it's a series of EP, but it's compiled in a slightly different way to how they were released as singles. But the part 1 is an LA fundamentalist preacher called Gene Scott, who apparently it was fundraising for the right wing, but apparently he took the nip one day and stormed off set and left an empty chair for 4 hours on his broadcast. Like, that's quite the huff. It's quite a huff, definitely. But
I think something Alex Jones would do.
I think we're in that territory. I think that kind of InfoWars kind of ranting. This is the genesis of a lot of that stuff. People staring down the camera and saying, no tips tonight. I want sacrifice. Is the quote. I mean, it's terrifying. And it reminds me a bit. Oliver Stone made a great drama that I love. It bombed, but it was called Wild Palms. And there's something very similar there. They created basically a program called Church Windows, and it was televangelism kind of coming in. He was predicting that televangelism was going to become a real political force.
There's a guy at the moment, a kind of bad actor, shall we say, called Joel Webbon, a Christian nationalist in the States, who's sort of embraced the kind of MAGA celebrity dynamic to simply, basically to say the most outrageous and offensive things within the Christian nationalist sort of guidelines regarding the roles of women or the LGBTQ plus community, all that kind of thing, and really monetizing that. Yeah. And so it does seem...
That's the grift.
Yeah, the grift is coming back with a vengeance. Yeah.
And in part 2, in Slugging for Jesus part 2, they're unashamed. I mean, it's an unashamed rant about the electronic pulpit. It's an unashamed rant about how right-wing Christianity can rig the Reagan election.
Yeah, that's right.
The
28 million, I think it's up to now, the voting bloc in the States, if you just, do that photo shoot with the ministers around you. That Trump
and they're all laying on of hands.
28 million votes out the bag.
This predicts all of this.
Yeah, and in an electorate that, by the time you get to the polls, there's probably less than 150 million Americans actually turn up at the voting booths. And so a 28 million block of that simply for that grift is pretty stunning head start.
And as you say, Mark, part 2 is a wee bit more ambient, but I think the kind of the paranoia and the anxiety starts to kind of shift and come through, and it is so prescient.
So the third part of that, Fool's Game, Slugging for Jesus part 3, is one that I'm not entirely sure. That's the
that's the 12th that it came out on.
Who was the artist that did that?
So it's Futura 2000. Who ended up doing all the Mowax art.
Nice.
So again, it's like this comes out, is it 80? It's either 82 or 83. It's 83. So by this time, they're very entrenched in the New York hip hop scene, and they're commissioning this. Yeah. Although he wasn't credited on the record.
Oops.
But it's credited on Discogs now. And this makes up one of the T-shirts that they've done, so I'm hoping he's getting a cut, But again, you've got that edge of hip hop and funk that they're really starting to kind of embrace.
Well, yeah, it's interesting because the song Fool's Game, Slugging for Jesus Part 3, it's got so many hints of James Brown style funk around it, that is that lead vocal a sample or something? I'm not sure.
Is it not vocodered?
Yeah, it's quite robotic.
Oh yeah, it's mal.
It's pitched.
It's mal, but it's just.
I'll be honest. I can't tell to what extent it's sincere and what extent it's taking the piss, because it is a little bit goofy.
Well, it's white boy rap. I think probably was.
It's the edges
sincere,
of
though.
rapping. I think that's what they're picking up,
Uh-huh.
and he's kind of picking up a wee bit of that and trying to throw it out there in an
I
angry
just
mess.
can't quite tell how much of it is tongue in cheek, if any of it. I will say the stereo image in that song is brilliant.
great.
See, if you listen to it in
Mhm.
headphones, there's this really crumbly percussion that crackles away in the extremes of the
Mhm.
image and really focuses you down the centre in the headphones. But musically, that third part, it doesn't really work for me. What does work for me in a big way is the
It's the
fourth
sample.
track.
No, I was going to say the sample, so the Jerry Falwell sample
Yeah.
in that third track.
huge figure,
So,
and
Enormous,
Yeah.
hugely destructive
Yeah.
figure in American society, head of the digital ministry. Very, he's pictured with Gerald Ford, Ronald Reagan, and both of the Bushes. Founded one of the first mega churches in the US. And that quote, "I'm sick and tired of hearing about all the radicals and the perverts and the liberals and the leftists. It's time for God's people to come out of the closet, come out of the churches and save America." That was used by the Shaman in Jesus Loves
that's
America.
right, aye.
So-
America with a K.
Yeah, so
Or KKK, in fact. Yeah.
because no, just one case.
Just one K.
But Stretchheads played with the Shaman quite a few times, and then our first record came out in Moksha. So Jesus Loves America, when it came out, the first time we played with them, I have to say, they were still coming out of their psychedelic period, and they were starting to embrace the technology, and they were getting very funky, and they were wholesale lifting from Cabaret Voltaire, I would have said. They had projections and stuff going on behind them. It's very much that kind of industrial stuff that they were coming up with. Then, laterally, obviously, they really embraced Acid House, but they went via Jesus Loves America, in Gorbachev We Trust, and they started playing the politics a wee bit.
Yeah.
So I remember doing a gig at the venue in Edinburgh, and the fucking Jesus Army were outside picketing the gig.
Oh wow. Okay.
It was exciting, and then for some perverse reason they decided to put a fucking wee hardcore band on that would do like 18 songs in 25 minutes. And I literally remember walking through the audience at a Shaman show, and the whole audience are just staring forward in complete shock. They just didn't know how to deal with it. The Shaman were funny as fuck. I mean, they were both lovely. Will sadly died. But Will was interviewing us for his fanzine while fucking Move Any Mountain was climbing up the charts.
That's
I mean, that's a measure of the guy. He was a total rebel. And they loved kind of playing with that. But it's very much lifting for me. It's not just the same sample, but they're kind of picking up the legacy of where Cabaret Voltaire could have gone if they really got stuff in the charts.
So the fourth track, Yashar, we've spoken about it in the earlier release, but Outer Limits vocal sample, chosen partly due to the band's kind of another enduring theme, which was the fascination with the weirdness of the future, in Miles' words. Eastern feel, we spoke as well about how they were really into Moroccan music, so it comes from that a bit. Combined, I believe, with sort of like jazz movements at the time, like Ornette Coleman, Miles Davis, John Coltrane, really what they were bringing into alternative sounds. The band supposedly wanted to avoid repeating themselves when they came up with that track, so they'd set out to do something quite different, and it did become a live favourite. We've covered it quite a bit already. It's an excellent piece of music.
Yeah, it's a really great song.
Yeah, so this is on this album, on this compilation, it's the original from 2x45, but John Robbie then remixed it for them, and it got released multiple times and became like a,
Is that
a
like a
dance floor.
massive hit for like that sort that
In like
remix?
New York,
Yeah.
I would say in like New York, I think where it belonged on the dance floor in New York, because the UK wasn't really ready for it. It was a reasonable. You wouldn't hear it at indie discos and stuff. You'd occasionally hear it. I mean, somewhere like the Hacienda, you would hear it. It would be a banger somewhere like that, but still quite niche where the UK are concerned.
The fifth one, Your Agent Man, is maybe a nod back to the kind of House of Jealous Lovers, rapture-y, kind of like acid punk. There we go. It's the
Factory version.
factory red sleeved vinyl. Kind of loads of harsh spring reverb guitar in it, and I think the bass writing is really strong in it. It's an obvious precursor to some of that kind of 90s new rave acid punk movement.
Yeah, I liked there's an affectation on his voice which sounds very German, like almost like Kraftwerk, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, the guitar they do this quite a lot. A guitar with like an extreme low pass filter on it, so it's just pure like hyper tinny as fuck, like it's been DI'd. I don't know if they were actually DIing guitars back then or just trying to make it happen in the room.
Probably
But
just putting them through effects units.
yeah, that's what I was thinking. Yeah,
On stage, aye.
That's what I'm talking about though when I say that when the Rapture and bands like that left those edges in, that is one of the most prominent nods to this to me, because it's harsh, it's confrontational, it's got that Albini-esque brightness, sharpness to it that immediately elevates it into something a little bit more alternative because it is a little bit difficult to listen to.
It feels like a sister track to, Seconds Too Late is always a big single and a big banger for them from the Rough Trade period. It's possibly my favourite ever Cabaret Voltaire song, Your Agent Man, because the bass playing is off the hook. It's got a perfect balance for me between what Mal's doing, and Mal's in the pocket doing vocals and doing those kind of, as you say, kind of Germanic style vocals. I think Kirky's guitar playing is actually really subtle and it kind of floats around, and then you get these washes that Chris is doing with the kind of electronic noise. It's a perfect balance. It clearly lifts from William Burroughs. It's got that paranoid kind of druggy edge to it. It sounds like a fucking detective movie soundtrack. And then, it's quite bold. It says, "We will deliver you from this Eastern sickness." Now, at the time, and not long around this time, there's the Pressure Company album, which is a live record that they did, and that's a fundraiser for Solidarity in Poland. So, are they talking about communism? Are they talking about the Iranian Revolution, which they were also talking about in interviews as well? And it's just, but again, it takes from that William Burroughs idea of kind of being a double agent and kind of working for the man, but at the same time, kind of like exploring this kind of interzone, as Burroughs would call it. So, I think it's an absolute wee masterpiece. It's a wee gem that and it was a B-side.
I'll be honest, talking to B-sides, and albeit Your Agent Man is your personal favourite, mine is probably Gut Level. I think
fantastic.
Gut Level is the standout here. I mean, Yashar is obviously the big
That's the
tune,
big hit.
but whilst Gut Level is maybe a bit dated now, there is something very enduring in the kind of relentless groove of it.
Yeah.
It is a real strong musicality. I think it's really quite accessible. And, between the sample dialogue and the kind of urban flow of the song, it feels much more American than British as a track.
Yeah.
Funnily enough as well, I think it's actually got a fair bit of Shaft vibes.
Well, that's
to
what I
it.
was saying earlier on. That this song and a lot of the songs in this record are deconstructed funk songs. This is the most deconstructed funk song of all of them. It's got all the elements of a funk song, just not constructed like a funk song would be. That 80s drum machine is really dodgy and kitsch sounding. It sounds really cool now, but back then I guess it was just basic, and that's just what they had. The organ is pure 70s funk all over it. It's a really cool song with a really interesting approach to the way it's constructed, I think.
And it starts off, but as I said earlier on, it kind of it seduces you into the first 30 seconds, and you're like, okay, I get this, I get this groove, and then the sample kicks in, and it says, "This woman's brain was cut in two. Vicky is one of 30 patients," and it fades off, and it's like, in the Industrial Handbook, Kirk's talking about being inspired by this VHS he got of like brain surgery, a documentary about brain surgery.
Wow.
Yeah.
So it's so on the money with like what 23 Skidoo were doing. So the first couple of 23 Skidoo records, really experimental. And, they've got a song called Mary's Operation that ends in a kind of loop, and it's a total whitey. So they're bringing in this lovely... and I say lovely.
It's so dank.
It's like the living legends of industrial culture. They made a lovely record, but it's so seductive, and then they just slam you with like, okay, here's a Brain Operation sample. Here's like street gangs. Like we weren't really that aware of what was going on in LA at the time, but they're getting hold of documentaries about like drug gangs and stuff. And they're bringing in a bit of sinister edge to it.
It is a little bit perverse, but in a good way, like the way they mix the sweet and the salty, having that, this track could be this, but we've put in something just a little bit unsettling to keep it on the balance, Invocation, a Christmas song, lads.
Yes. I mean, talking of perversion.
Not exactly obvious when you listen to it, but I think Mal says they regularly obviously dropped humour into the releases. We've talked about that, and this was one, and Mal particularly liked this song as one of his favourites.
Yeah, he went on record and interviewed at the time saying it was one of the things he felt was the most accomplished the most accomplished that they'd ever achieved as a band. And Crepuscule were pretty famous for their compilations. I mean, quite a well-marketed label, beautifully styled label as well. Incredible home of all sorts of stuff. Tuxedo Moon, you mentioned earlier on, really, really great canon of work. I mean, it's still to this day an amazing label. But the idea that you would get all these weird bands and get them to do Christmas tunes and Cabaret Voltaire's, the Invocation's in the post, and it's invoking something very unchristian.
Yeah, it is.
I mean,
and in the context of the Christian nationalism as well, it's fascinating.
Yeah, and they'd been to Haiti, they'd filmed stuff in Haiti, they were really interested in voodoo. They were deep. They were doing something, and it's unsettling, but at the same time, it's really beautiful. It's a gorgeous track.
I would say, you know, it feels like you know, the house stuff they kind of did in the 90s. It feels like the early version of that to me.
It's maybe kind of proto.
Yeah, it's quite prescient in that regard. It's got a lot of nice sounds in it, you know.
Yeah. This is also the juncture as well, where they're meeting up with Paul Haig from Joseph K, and Paul Haig's making he's making really shiny pop. Very, very pioneering, it has to be said, at the time, in terms of making, and I think he's an absolute genius. And you know, he's trying to get Ghost Rider, a cover version of Ghost Rider by Suicides in the charts, right?
Yeah, that's
and
right,
it's great. You know, it wasn't going to make the charts, but you know, it had good intention. So he collaborates with Cabaret Voltaire, and there's a couple of tracks that came out on the box set, Paul Haig box set that came out a couple of years ago, called The Executioner, and that was actually going to become a new project, was Paul Haig with Cabaret Voltaire. So the label becomes a bit of a kind of cauldron for them, and I think it's a wee bit of a port in a storm, a wee bit of a harbour for them when they're in the midst of about to take on this Virgin deal, or they've just taken on this kind of Virgin deal, and they're exploring the funk, and they're exploring what they can do with the funk, but they can't quite let go of that kind of slightly perverse edge of their industrial past. And I think they're exploring something with Paul Haig as well about like what's songcraft? How do you do songcraft? Because that's kind of what's in the contract with Virgin when they do the Crackdown.
So to round it off in unusual style, we could track out the theme from Shaft, which is another moment I'm not really sure what to make of, because first of all, how much of them is actually them playing? How much of it is actually them playing, and how much of it is sampled audio? I can't quite determine that. It's a weird, languid collage. With it's. I personally feel it's got an almost contemptuous guitar line in it. Right? It feels like it's satirising the original instead of there being any sort of real deference. And I will say musically, I think it's a bit of a low energy ending, given that gut level is such a high. I'm not sure how I feel about it, although in terms of playfulness and humour, it clearly serves a purpose. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I think, they wouldn't have had at that point necessarily access to samplers. So, I mean, they might have been manipulating some tape stuff
jamming
from the
along
original, but I think they were just having fun and jamming with it. And blaxploitation films and horror and all of that, again, it's all there in the Industrial Handbook in terms of all of their influences and the love. The love. I don't see it as a piss take, but I see it as them just having a bit of fun with something and trying to kind of find those early experiences of just falling about the studio laughing and just literally just playing with the material. It didn't actually come out until much later. It sat on the cutting room floor, so it kind of made its debut in '87 on this compilation. Yeah. But it sat on the kind of cutting room floor, and it wasn't released till a few years later, and it came out on a kind of soundtracks compilation that Crepuscule decided to do. Yeah.
I bet it stuck out like a sore thumb on that as well.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of conclusions, right, this sort of deep dive is hugely daunting. They are a band that a lot of people, including myself, had crossed paths with, but in terms of trying to grasp the arc of their evolution as well as their motivations and their methods, it's quite a task. I think maybe to echo the evangelical themes of that last record, we Unsung are here to suffer for you. So when it comes to these challenges, we take them on, albeit with a little bit of a run up and a very deep breath. Not that Cabaret Voltaire is not frequently rewarding, but it is a challenging body of work. And yes, public, for those of you who are not into them, you are welcome. But it's another one of those shows where you're able to kind of reorganize like a mammoth tangle. Allow me to maybe mix my metaphors a bit here, but you know when you go into an old cable bag, Phil, Mark, you know what I'm talking about, and you take the time to unwind them all and coil them up and tidy them away, and you might not use them again, and almost certainly some of them are crackly and a bit shit, but there is a sense of a job well done, you know, and I feel a wee bit like that about some of the Cabaret Voltaire stuff. I'm not sure I'll go back to it. Some of it was definitely crackly and a bit shit for me, but some of it was incredibly rewarding, and some of it I'm really glad that I took the time to do it and to unravel it and to tidy it and to understand it in the context of their career. I think, covering bands like Cabaret Voltaire as well. Here's my second of the mixed metaphors. Is a bit like, remember that desktop PC game Minefield? It was on all the, it was like in there with like solitaire and all that kind of stuff, right? And you click the button and you'd either hit the mine or it would open up, and you never knew how many boxes you'd open up. Cabaret Voltaire is one of those ones that you click it and it opens up loads of boxes, because suddenly the musical map makes a lot more sense once you're familiar with the band, especially the musical map of that era, but not just that era, like onwards as well. The band are hugely influential, and for my third of my mixed metaphors, they are connective tissue between so many sounds and so many genres from the 70s right the way up to the present day, where, as I said, there are bands in Glasgow that I'm like, well, they sound like someone, but I don't know who it is. Well, now I know who it is. And their influence continues to reverberate down those years. On reflection, I think the high in 2x45 is my Goldilocks era for my personal tastes. It's when I started to notice their influence on acts I grew to love, including Fugazi, who I mentioned. Beforehand, I get a little bit worn down by the non-conformity, by the obstinate non-conformity. Meanwhile, sort of the Crackdown onwards wanders a little bit too close to some sort of whack white guy rap at points for me to completely suspend my disbelief. 8 Crepuscule tracks is a fascinating choice, I think, Phil, because it really bridges all of the above.
Yeah.
Slugging for Jesus Part 2 is pleasingly cynical and critical as subject matter, but it's a tough shift. Yeah. It's a tough listen. As is their take on the Shaft soundtrack. But Gut Level, on the other hand, is a terrific missing link, and Yashar is rightly revered. So I think that, combined with, as you say, the limited kind of circulatory nature of the copies and stuff now, it makes it a bit of a no-brainer, I think, in terms of qualifying as unsung, and I'm really pleased that that's what you chose.
Tough hang. Tough hang.
It's frightening for me as well, because I'm like a huge fan.
He's got that 1,000-yard stare on the go.
Yeah, it's I'll just say it. I'm sorry, Phil, but this is the kind of shit that makes me hate this podcast. When we need to do a big discography and parts of it just run off me like oil. You know
Absolutely.
what I mean? And it makes, this is what, like, I know when something's daunting and you need to tackle it, and I do appreciate that experience of doing that. I feel as though I've been down a mine and come back up and lived to tell the tale,
To be fair though,
Shawshank Redemption.
Yeah, pretty much.
You crawled through that river of shit. You were down that mine, but you emerged with a couple of diamonds, because there's definitely a couple of things in this that I know you did like.
Yeah, there's stuff that I liked. It's just so few and far between that it makes that I would rather listen to this. If I just listened to this record, I would have been much happier. Probably,
I think it's an easier ride, and I think that there's a couple of great compilations out there. The experimental stuff is like Listen Up and all their B-sides and things. The Living Legends, the Golden Era. There's lots of that kind of stuff. They've repackaged their own kind of like funky mid-80s period themselves several times. It's daunting for me because I have such an attachment, but what's so great is I have a real nostalgic attachment to that era that left you cold, and that's good because it detaches me from the Matrix a wee bit. That I think that there's something that they cannot help but play with in terms of nostalgia. And when you go to the gig, when I saw them in Sheffield, that was like 2,000 middle-aged guys punching the air, and I was a bit like, where are all the women at? There was a few women, but but it's something that's not their fault. That's not their fault, but they're gonna have to do that. But I do think that there is knowing people like Katie Shambles, Rebecca, being good friends with Keith as well before we lost we lost Keith McIver. I know that they're also revered by a lot of young people that are actually well up for that dive, and also can keep some of that cheese in context.
They go down really well at nights like So Low, that really dark kind of esoteric clubby kind of like gothy thing as well.
And in a way, that's what they were writing it for. They weren't really writing it to go in the charts.
Sounds amazing through a good sound system,
a big
and a night
PA.
like that,
and seeing them live, I have to say, because they're playing the Barrowlands in October, I think. So seeing them live through a decent PA and hearing that, I mean, Mal's bass as well, it's like he's a master of the craft.
Yeah.
I'm surprised that Code didn't resonate better with you. I thought the fact that it sounds like it's just before Pretty Hate Machine mixed with some Prince, I thought that would actually be something that would really click with you.
It's just their deconstruction of funk is just it strays too far away from the things I enjoy about that kind of music, you know.
Interesting.
But I think to your point of them being a good singles band, I think they are. The period that you left you cold is probably the period I would go back to personally. You know, the Crackdown. I think for me, when I was listening to it, I was like that and Micro-Phonies were the two records that actually like remained in my brain. Yeah. You know, like I said, 24 is still stuck in my head. I still think it's a really good bit of writing, you know. But yeah, this is what makes it tough sometimes, you know. But like I said, I do feel as though that I've learned a lot by doing it. You know, I didn't hate the experience. It was tiring.
Phil, I think it's good you made him work for his money.
No, it is exhausting, and it's an exhausting period and experience for a lot of musicians to kind of have that length of career and kind of been what they've been through, but also and kind of come out intact. Unfortunately, we lost Richard, but I think when the Living Legends came out, when Mute released the compilation, I was like, well, who the fuck do they think they are? But it's like, but they are pretty legendary, and we kind of need people like that. And I'm curious about that world, and they're lovely people, and they didn't fuck anybody over. You know, there's other people you could pick at the scab, as we will do with Coil. Yeah, you can pick at the scab of a lot of industrial music and a lot of that industrial kind of culture. A big Clock DVA fan as well, but you know, this is someone who wasn't averse to just taking all the equipment at the studio, getting in a van and fucking stealing it and driving away. You know, I mean, there's people that have got shit to say about a lot of characters, but no one's got anybody but a good word to say about Cabaret Voltaire. Kirk could be cantankerous, we know this. You know, he could be quite crabby, a bit spiky. But they were and they still are loved, and I think that's unusual in that genre. Yeah, I
think one thing that I really liked about them generally is that they just stuck to their guns like at every single moment. You know, sometimes to their detriment in the early 90s. You know, I think that was probably their undoing at that point. You know, because they were trying to cotton onto something which they'd kind of touched, but which is now not cool. You know, but everything else, even including that, is all very uncompromised. You know, even when they're on the major label and are trying to be poppy, it's not really there. You know, it's still them.
I think it's a lot of it's a timing issue. If I remember that time, and you know, I told you I didn't really get back into kind of noise rock again until Dempsey took me to see the Jesus Lord, and I was like, what? They're still a thing? And I got right back into it again because there's easily a 5-year period. I went to see Otechra and fucking Hope Street, you know, and I saw Square Pusher and Aphex at the QM, and there was an electronic
that
period
had vitality that
and for me, that's what was so disappointing about some of that period. You know, that they were emulating that, but you could go and buy a record on Warp immediately, and it was head and shoulders above what they were trying to do. So
at their best, I think they are a lesson in not compromising. Yeah, and I think that is, for better or worse, depending on your perspective on the different records, the lesson abides regardless of how much you love the album. They wanted to do what they wanted to do, and it worked out reasonably well for them. They've got a real legacy, a real footprint on music and pop culture to some extent. And I think in that respect alone, they are like worthy of your admiration. Also, as Phil says, if you've listened to this show, these shows, and you like what you hear, they are playing in Glasgow. They're doing a UK tour, doing an American tour. It looks like they're doing a European tour.
Australia, I think. They've done some shows in
so you can, this would be your last chance to see this live. So
yeah, he's definitely, Mal's retired, and he's definitely. I mean, it has to be said, in most recent years in live work, he's earned his chops working with John Grant.
Yeah, that's right.
He's done the Creep Show project with John. He's got his live set up down. So I mean, for this as well, we'll leave a couple of wee references which I've sent you. But if you can get hold of it, The Art of the Sixth Sense is the kind of Bible
of their period. M. Fish.
So that's Mick Fish.
That came in on drums.
Yeah, that played drums. He brought out his own book as well, and we'll leave a wee reference for that. But that covers the period up to kind of Code. Yeah. So that's a really good deep dive, I think, into their culture. And then thankfully, if you are researching them, there is a collection. There's a full collection of every interview they did from 1977 to 1994, which is now available as an ebook apparently for €10. €10. But the thing that was useful for me was kind of going back. But you see the same themes of paranoia and the media, and then they always claim they were never a political band, but if you're listening to Slogging for Jesus, I mean, it's prescient.
There's no doubt.
Yeah, political is a very elastic term, really, but they might not be talking about political parties, but there's certainly a politics.
Aye.
Yeah.
And it's the gift of growing up in the People's Republic of Sheffield.
Yeah.
Well, Phil, it's been a real pleasure. A real pleasure, honestly. And
thanks for the slug.
I think the bad news is it's probably easier than the Coil episode's going to be.
We need to give ourselves a few months, I think, to brace ourselves for that.
Get back into rehab.
But I hope the suggestion's useful, because I do think that there's it's another kind of transitional object.
Yes.
I think in the career pathway of Coil.
Aye. The Venn diagram applies as well. There's a lot of overlap. Phil, look after yourself.
Thank you.
Going to be
honoured
soon.
We've got December dates, and then we don't have dates in the diary. We might get offers, but we're going to concentrate on actually spunking out an album, and we're just going to DIY that. And then we're hoping if we get us a bit of funding, that would be lovely. And then we've got dates in December. We've got 6 or 7 dates lined up already, finishing on the 12th of December in stereo.
Yeah. So I've Doom Cabaret with members of the Salvo, Mogwai, who else? Aerogram.
Take a Worm for a Walk.
Take a Worm. Twilight Sad. I guess.
Yeah, we're a super group.
Is up your street. Then getting about it, as well as any number of Phil's own projects. We'll try and put some links down. You look after yourself, and we're going to see you soon enough.
You too, guys. Yeah. Thanks. Big fan of the podcast.
Thanks for coming on.
It's been a real honour to come on.
Appreciate
Thank you.
Thanks for remembering to say that. Like we tell you.
Cheers.